It just seems that issues about our liberty and our security are constantly being decided by a handful of people, which is not the way this republic is supposed to work. As the Washington Times writes, in this first round of briefs, the parties offered their arguments on two key questions the court will consider: whether an individual mandate under the law requiring Americans to obtain health coverage or pay a fine is constitutional, and whether the mandate is essential to the rest of the law, an issue called severability. Standing its ground on the individual mandate, the administration is offering a three-pronged argument that the mandate helps solve a problem of national concern. Yeah, let's stop right there. Let's say they honestly believe it solves a problem of national concern. It has to be constitutional. That it regulates economic behavior, that deals with regulating interstate commerce? Of course it doesn't. No commerce is not commerce. Forcing people to enter into private contracts for something they may not want, on terms they may not want. I mean, folks, this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. This is what I mean when I say a post-constitutional America. These are viewed as legitimate arguments. And they're viewed as legitimate arguments by a lot of judges. And yet, to understand our founders, to understand the people who met in Philadelphia to develop a constitution and adopt it, to understand some of the philosophers they relied on, this wouldn't pass the laugh test. The Constitution exists to preserve our society, not to create an all-powerful government to push us around. It's that simple. And in preserving our society, it's intended to preserve your individual liberty. Not your liberty to harm somebody, not your liberty to steal. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about your moral, God-given right to individual liberty, your sovereignty, your personhood. It wouldn't even cross their minds to empower the federal government or any part of the federal government to tell you that you would have to purchase something because it's in your best interest. They most assuredly would label that tyranny. And the problem is, we have spiraled so far out of control that these are considered legitimate arguments under the Constitution, even though they're not. There is no basis whatsoever in our history for this kind of a law. None. And we don't much give a damn if the masterminds think that it's the right thing to do or if they're seeking to balance budgets when they never do. None of that matters. They do not have the authority to do it. And the people who fought to create this nation, and then the people after we won the revolution who sat down and developed our Constitution and argued over it and then adopted it, sent it to the states for ratification. You know what's interesting about that? I think if it happened all over again today, these clowns in Washington wouldn't be sending anything to the states. They wouldn't give a damn about the states, would they? And yet the states had to ratify the Constitution or there'd be no Constitution. There'd be no federal court. There'd be no federal executive branch or Congress. There'd be no Supreme Court to decide whether or not individuals are free. This Obamacare lawsuit is about more than health care, although it's certainly about that. It's about a hell of a lot more than that. It's about whether there's any more line drawing when it comes to the power of the federal government. And basically the Obama administration predictably is arguing no. Well, they won't put it in so many words, but you and I know exactly what they mean, don't we? We know exactly what they're up to. They're used to fooling us, pretending that they're not seizing power. And yet this, is a blatant power grab. Blatant. So, and the idea that it's left, this is no certain case, by the way. Even though it is when you apply the Constitution, we can't be sure how these justices are going to turn out. In Ameritopia, I even address this. Then I say the most pernicious aspect of the PPACA, Obamacare, has nothing to do with health care per se. Specifically, the statute dictates that an individual who does not have health care, but who can afford it, must purchase a private health insurance policy, whether he wants to or not, or face federal fines and penalties. In response to litigation challenging the constitutionality of this individual mandate, the Obama administration argues that the mandate is nothing more than Congress exercising its authority under the Constitution's Commerce Clause. But the Commerce Clause says this: Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. Period. Unquote. The plain meaning of this language provides no support for the authority the federal government demands. Congress can tax interstate commerce, regulate interstate commerce, and even prohibit certain types of interstate commerce. But there is nothing in that clause, anywhere else in the Constitution, or in this nation's history, let alone the history of the Constitution and the Commerce Clause, empowering Congress or any part of the federal government to regulate inactivity and compel an individual to enter into commerce. That is, to enter into a legally binding private contract against the individual's will and interests simply because the individual is living and breathing. Now, should such a specious and brazen contortion of fact and history prevail in the courts as a constitutionally recognized and legally enforceable imperative, this is from Ameritopia, the contours of utopian society and the mastermind's authority would seem unconfined. Thereafter, the individual's free will ceases to be free or his will, and the mastermind's duping becomes an unnecessary artifice, for the federal government can now flatly dictate the individual's behavior, and the individual is without legal recourse. The individual is without legal recourse. Tyranny then will reveal itself, unvarnished and unequivocal, with future governmental trespasses on individual sovereignty both certain and more onerous. That's what's at stake. Now, this is what is interesting, or this is what needs to be underscored. Look where Obama takes this country, time and again, to the brink of a constitutional crisis, time and again. Whether it's the individual mandate, which is a direct assault on individualism, on your sovereignty as a human being. Whether it's the other day, taking the country to the brink by bypassing the advice and consent provision of the United States Constitution and appointing 4 individuals to positions they now do not hold with constitutional authority. Again, pushing us to the brink. Insisting that when he signs a massive budget bill, that he will decide what he will comply with and what he won't. Pushing us to a constitutional crisis brink. And as I played over and over again, the audio of him stating in Ohio, and I paraphrase, if Congress refuses to go along with what he wants, he will do it by himself. I paraphrase because he more articulately stated the case for a dictatorship than I did. Time and again, he pushes us to the brink. He wants to crack us. He wants to crack this society. He wants to crack the Constitution. And for what? Because he has an ideal model in his head of what society should look like? Because he thinks he knows how we should live, where we should live?